The wind moved through the tall black trees and carried the smell of rain across the strange forest where the sky burned red like a dying fire, and Cole walked alone with slow steps, as if the ground itself might bite him at any moment, and far in the dark, under the twisting roots and thorny branches, dozens of tiny eyes glowed and blinked like pieces of broken glass, catching light. He had been told by the other settlers to never walk near the den area, and to never even look at the cubs, for they feared every living thing on this world, and would strike without warning and without mercy, and many had tried to get close, but all had come away with deep wounds and shame in their eyes. Cole had heard the warnings, yet his mind did not hold fear in the same way as the others, and the stories only pulled him forward step by step until he reached the place where the earth dipped and the old tree trunks leaned over each other like crooked spears, and there the cubs watched him from the shadows, small and quick, with fur like smoke and claws like needles. They hissed and backed away into the dark, yet one cub did not move, and instead stayed crouched near a low rock, its head tilted, as if it was trying to understand him, its eyes like tiny suns flickering in the gloom. Cole knelt down slowly, letting his pack slide from his shoulder, and reached inside to pull out a small pouch of food rations wrapped in a thin sheet. He placed it on the ground in front of him, and then leaned back on his heels, making no sound and no sudden move. The cub did not come forward, it only stared as the wind swirled between them, carrying his scent into the shadows, and in the branches, above some hidden bird, gave a single low cry before falling silent again, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. From far behind him voices whispered, and he knew the settlers were watching from the ridge, their words full of doubt and fear, saying he would be attacked, saying he would not return, saying the cubs could never trust a human again. But Cole stayed kneeling, letting the forest time pass over him, and the cub, still watching him, seemed to breathe slower, as if its small heart had slowed just enough to stay curious instead of running, and the air felt heavier and warmer around them like a fragile bridge between two worlds. When the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched long, Cole rose to his feet and stepped back, leaving the food where it lay. He turned without looking again and walked away into the dim path back toward the settlement, hearing only the soft rustle of movement behind him, though he did not turn to see which cub had taken the gift. The settlement gates closed behind him with a dull sound, and the smell of the cooking fires filled the air, but in his mind the image of the still cub, with tilted head, stayed sharp, as if carved in stone. And later, when night spread over the land, and the alien moon rose pale and swollen over the forest, Cole sat in his small shelter, listening to the low hum of the heaters and the slow patter of rain on the metal roof. Then he heard, at the faint sound of claws on the outer wall, a slow, deliberate scrape, as if something was testing the strength of the barrier, then silence. Then another scrape, a little closer to the door. Cole rose and took the lantern from the table, lifting it toward the noise, his heartbeat steady but heavy in his chest. The shadows outside shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw two small points of orange light low to the ground like the eyes of a patient watcher. He stepped closer to the door, listening. The rain soft against the roof, and the cold night air leaking through the thin cracks. The scrape came again, and this time it was right at the door, not loud, not hurried, but slow and deliberate, like the touch of someone who was not afraid. The latch moved slightly under his hand, as if it was being pushed from the outside. A pause followed, then a light sound almost like a breath against the wood, and Cole stood still with the lantern in hand, the flame shaking a little in the glass. He thought of the warning voices and the fearful eyes of the settlers. He thought of the cub crouched in the forest, and the way it had not moved even when the others fled, and he wondered if this was the same one, if it had followed him through the shadows all the way back here. The night outside felt wide and empty, but also full of eyes that saw more than he could see, and for the first time since arriving on Ravax, for he felt not like a stranger walking through someone else's land, but like a figure being weighed, measured, and judged in a language older than any human tongue. The scrape stopped at last, and the sound of small footsteps faded into the rain, leaving only the steady hum of the heater and the echo of that strange moment. In his mind, Cole set the lantern back on the table, but he did not sleep. Instead, he sat in the dim light, waiting for the sound to return. The pale light of dawn spilled through the cracks in the settlement walls, and the air was damp and cold, and Cole woke with the faint smell of wet earth in his nose, and for a moment he thought the night before had been nothing but a strange dream. But then he saw the marks on the door, thin and sharp, as if made by small curved claws, and he knew the visitor had been real. He pushed the door open slowly, and the forest mist rolled in soft and white, wrapping around his boots and making the world look like it was drifting somewhere between waking and sleeping. And there on the edge of the path, no more than 10 steps away, sat the cub, its fur damp from the night, its eyes fixed on him with a steady, unblinking gaze. Cole stood still, letting the silence stretch between them, and after a long moment he reached into his pack and pulled out the same kind of food he had left yesterday, and he placed it on the ground in front of him and stepped back, keeping his movements slow and even. The cub did not run, it did not growl, it simply tilted its head again and sniffed the air as though it was measuring the truth of his scent. The rain from the night still clung to its whiskers like beads of glass, and its small chest rose and fell in calm, steady rhythm, and for a moment it felt less like an animal and more like a guard at a doorway, deciding if he should be allowed to pass. From the ridge above the settlement, one of the older settlers called down to him, telling him to come away, warning him again about the cubs, and how no human could earn their trust, because long ago humans had hunted their kind for sport and profit, and though that was the work of another generation, the memory lived in them as sharp as their teeth. Cole ignored the voice and lowered himself to a crouch, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving the cub, and the cub never looking away either. The moment seemed to stretch like a rope between them, pulled tight and thin, but not breaking. Minutes passed, and the cub stepped forward one pace, then another, its paws almost soundless on the damp ground, and it stopped just short of the food, leaning its head down to sniff, and then looking back up at him again, as though seeking some kind of permission before taking the first bite, and chewing slowly, its gaze never leaving his face. Cole let out a slow breath, and stayed where he was, not reaching forward, not making any sign of wanting to touch it, and the cub seemed to take the stillness as an answer, and continued eating until nothing was left, and when it was done it sat for a moment looking at him, then turned and padded back into the mist, without a sound. That afternoon Cole walked back to the den area, where the trees grew thicker, and the air was cooler under their black twisted branches. The light here was strange, shifting between deep shadow and dim green glow from the moss that covered the trunks, and he could feel eyes watching him from every angle, but saw only brief flashes of movement when one of the cubs darted between rocks or ducked behind a root. He found the same low rock where he had left the food yesterday and sat down beside it, taking out more rations and setting them in the open. This time he did not just wait, he spoke in a quiet voice, not words of command or coaxing, but low, calm sounds, the way one might speak to a restless horse. And though he did not know if the cubs understood anything in the tone, they did not flee. One of the older cubs came close enough for him to see the faint scar that ran along its side, a mark from some long-healed wound, and it stared at him for a long time before taking the food and darting back, but halfway to the trees it stopped and turned as if unsure if it should leave. Cole remained seated, letting the forest sounds fill the air, the creak of branches, the distant rush of water, the quiet tapping of something moving across the leaves overhead, and though the cubs kept their distance, more of them began to appear, their eyes glowing faint in the dim light, until there were at least 10, watching him from every side. The settlers had said the cubs were only dangerous when cornered, yet the air here felt like standing in a circle of knives waiting for one to move, and in that strange stillness Cole felt that each small creature was weighing him, not for threat, but for something else, something older than fear or anger. As the sun began to lower again, he stood slowly and backed away, without turning his back on them, until the trees thinned and the misty field opened before him, and he could see the settlement walls in the distance, and the faint smoke of cooking fires curling into the air. But as he reached the halfway point across the open ground, a sound rolled through the air, a long, low howl from deep within the forest, followed by another and another, until the very ground seemed to hum with the noise. It was a sound that made the skin prickle and the breath catch in the throat, and even the wind seemed to stop to listen. From the walls voices called to him, sharp and urgent, telling him to hurry, because night hunters were on the move, and even the strongest doors could not keep them out if they wanted to come in. But Cole did not run. He turned to look back at the tree line, where the last of the light was fading, and he saw the cub, with the damp fur, standing there alone, its head low, and its ears pinned back, in what could only be fear. In that moment he knew the howl had not been meant for him, it had been meant for them, and whatever hunted in the night was a danger to the cubs, far greater than any human could be. and before he could move the cub turned and vanished into the trees, swallowed by shadow, as if it had never been there at all. The voices from the wall kept calling, telling him to move faster, but Cole walked instead, his mind turning over the sound of that howl and the look in the cub's eyes, because fear was the one thing he had not expected to see there, and now it was clear that whatever had made that sound was feared by the cubs more than they feared him. That night the air in the settlement felt heavier than usual, and the fire seemed to burn lower. Though no one had touched them, the settlers spoke in low voices about old stories of predators that moved in the mist and took what they wanted without leaving a trace, and Cole listened, without saying a word, his thoughts still caught on the sight of that cub alone in the shadow, with fear written in every line of its small body. When the last of the fires had burned to embers, and the gates had been shut for the night, Cole sat in his shelter listening to the silence and the slow creak of wood in the cold air, and though nothing moved outside, he felt in his bones that the forest was watching and waiting, and that the real test had not yet begun. The night came heavy over the forest, and the red glow of the alien sky sank into a deep purple that seemed to press down on the land, and the settlers locked their gates and barred their windows, and not one of them spoke above a whisper, for the howl from the trees still echoed in their minds, and no one wished to draw attention from whatever creature had made it. Cole stood outside the main gate despite the warnings, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil as he scanned the black line of trees, the mist curling like cold breath across the open ground, and there in the dark he felt movement not in sight, but in the air itself, as if something old and patient was waiting just beyond his reach. The forest was never silent, but tonight the usual calls of night birds and the clicking of insect wings were gone, replaced by a low sound almost too deep to hear that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, and Cole knew, without question, that the cubs could hear it too, because far to his left in the shadowed edges of the tree-lean shapes began to appear small and hunched the cubs gathered together, their glowing eyes wide, their bodies pressed close to one another. They were not hissing or growling now, instead they were still, their ears laid flat, their tails stiff, and low, a silent language of fear that even a human could read, and Cole knew the danger was real. The settlers shouted again from the wall, telling him to come inside, to leave the cubs to their fate, but something inside him rooted his feet to the ground. The mist thickened, hiding the edges of the trees, until the dark seemed to bend and shape itself into a deeper shadow that moved slowly forward, and then a shape broke from the blackness, massive and low to the ground, its body sleek and rippling with muscle, its fur so dark it swallowed the torchlight from a wall, and its eyes were molten gold, burning through the mist like twin suns in a dead sky. The cubs pressed together tighter, some backing away, others frozen, and Cole saw in that instant what hunted them. This was no simple predator of tooth and claw. This was something made for the hunt, something that lived for the chase. Its head was low, its shoulders rolling as it stepped forward, each motion slow and certain, as if the prey could not escape no matter where it ran. Cole's hand found the torch leaning against the gatepost, and he lifted it high, the flame flickering wildly as the damp wind caught it, and the golden eyes shifted to him. For a moment the predator froze, its gaze locked on his, then its lips curled back in a silent snarl, showing teeth long and curved and sharp as bone knives. It began to move again, circling slowly toward the cubs, its focus shifting between him and them, and Cole stepped forward, placing himself between the cubs and the hunter, the heat of the torch at his side and the cold mist against his back. The predator paused at this, and its head tilted slightly, as though trying to understand why he did not move away. From the wall someone shouted his name, but it was distant, almost lost under the sound of the low growl that began to rise from the predator's chest, a sound so deep it seemed to pass through him into the earth and back again, and the cubs behind him trembled, but did not run. They stayed huddled together, their eyes fixed on him. The predator stepped closer, its paws silent in the grass, the golden eyes never blinking, and Cole could see now the faint lines of old scars across its muzzle, marks from battles long past. This was a creature that had survived everything the forest could throw at it and feared nothing, and yet here it was watching him as if weighing the cost of moving forward. Cole raised the torch higher, letting the flame flare brighter, the heat brushing against his face, and he took one step forward, and then another, his boots sinking into the damp ground. The predator stopped for a breath, then began to pace to his left, slow and deliberate, trying to find an opening to get around him toward the cubs. He mirrored its movements, keeping himself between it and them, his eyes never leaving its face. And for a moment, they moved like two fighters, in a ring. Each step matched each pause, measured, the only sound the slow crackle of the torch and the low rumble from the predator's chest. Then, without warning, it lowered its body and sprang forward, the golden eyes flaring bright, the ground seeming to vanish under its leap. And Cole swung the torch in a wide arc, the flame trailing a streak of light through the mist and striking the predator across the face. The beast twisted mid-leap, its momentum carrying it past him into the ground with a hiss of pain. It rolled and came up low again, its head jerking back from the heat, and for the first time Cole saw hesitation in its movements. It backed away a step, and then another, still growling, but no longer advancing, and the cubs behind him let out small, sharp cries, not of fear, but of something closer to warning, as if they knew this was not over. The predator began to circle again, but its path was wider, now its golden eyes never leaving the flame, and Cole moved with it, his breath steady, though his arms ached from holding the torch high. He knew if the fire went out, they would be nothing but prey in the dark. Then from deep in the forest came another sound, a second growl, lower and heavier than the first, and Cole saw the predator pause and turn its head toward the trees. And in that instant he understood this was not the only one hunting tonight. There were more than one, and the second was close, very close. The cubs pressed closer against each other, their eyes wide, their bodies shaking, and Cole could feel the air shift, the mist parting slightly as something larger moved within it. The first predator backed away further, its growl shifting into something like a call, a signal answered moments later by another from the trees. The settlers on the wall shouted again, some firing warning flares into the air, but the light only lasted a moment before the mist swallowed it, and the forest returned to its shadowed shape, the two golden eyes still fixed on him, and now another pair, faint but growing brighter as the second predator stepped into view. Cole tightened his grip on the torch and shifted his stance, keeping himself between the cubs and the approaching shapes. The fire crackled in his hand, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground, and in that moment he knew there would be no rest tonight, because the predators had found their prey, and the hunt had only just begun. The first predator kept its golden eyes locked on Cole, while the second moved slowly from the shadow of the trees, its body larger and heavier, its fur rippling like liquid shadow under the pale light from the torches on the wall. The settlers above shifted nervously, their hands gripping the edges of the barricade, yet no one dared to climb down and help, for the fear that hung over the clearing was thick and cold and seemed to choke the breath from the throat. Cole's arm ached from holding the torch high, but he kept it steady, the flame swaying in the damp air, the heat brushing against his face as the two predators began to spread apart, one to his left and the other to his right, each step careful and silent as they sought to close the distance from both sides. The cubs behind him pressed tighter, their small bodies trembling, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if waiting for the moment to run, yet none of them moved, for they knew to run now would be to die. The first predator let out a low growl, its head lowering as its muscles bunched beneath the skin, and Cole shifted his weight on his feet, ready for the leap he knew would come. The second predator mirrored the sound, its voice deeper, like a rumble from the earth itself, and Cole's eyes flicked between them, his mind racing for any move that might keep them back. He stepped toward the first predator, swinging the torch in a slow arc, the flame hissing as the damp mist curled around it. The creature stopped its advance for a breath, but the second used that pause to lunge forward, its body a blur of black and gold in the gloom. Cole spun toward it, jabbing the burning end toward its face, the smell of scorched fur mixing with the wet air as the beast recoiled with a snarl. The cubs cried out sharp and quick, and the first predator took its chance to dart forward, but Cole pivoted the torch again, the flame passing inches from its muzzle, forcing it to stop mid-stride. The heat seemed to hold them at bay, but he could see the hunger in their eyes, the patience of hunters who knew the night was theirs and that his strength would not last forever. From the wall a flare shot into the sky, bursting in white light that bled through the mist, and for a heartbeat the clearing was bright enough to see the glistening teeth and rippling muscles of the predators, but the light faded too quickly, swallowed by the heavy air, and once again they were shadows, shifting just beyond reach. Cole's breath came slow and heavy, the ache in his arm spreading to his shoulder, and still the predators circled, looking for the smallest gap, the tiniest slip of his focus. Then from behind him one of the older cubs let out a long, sharp call, a sound unlike fear, more like command, and the other cubs shifted, forming a tight half-circle behind him, their eyes locked on the predators, as if ready to spring. The first predator noticed and let out a growl that rose in pitch, and the second answered with a deep bellow, the sound vibrating through Cole's chest. Then they both lunged at once, one from the left, one from the right, and Cole stepped forward into the first, swinging the torch hard enough to send sparks flying through the mist. The beast twisted away, but its shoulder caught the flame, and it leapt back, snarling. The second came within a hair of his side before pulling away from the sudden heat. In the chaos, the cubs moved with sudden speed, darting forward not to attack, but to take new positions, flanking the predators in a way that forced them to turn their heads and split their focus. Cole saw the shift and pressed forward again, using the flame to push one predator toward the tree-line, the cubs moving in sync to cut off escape routes until the larger beast gave a sharp hiss and backed deeper into the shadow. The first predator, however, did not retreat. It crouched low, its tail lashing the ground, its eyes fixed on Cole with a look that was more than hunger. It was challenge. It stepped forward, and Cole stepped toward it, neither breaking gaze. The cubs stayed still, the mist curling around them like ghostly armor. The predator lunged again, but this time Cole did not swing. He thrust the torch straight forward, the flame meeting the open mouth with a rush of heat and light. The beast snapped, its jaws closed with a hiss, leaping back into the mist, its golden eyes fading as it retreated. The cubs gave a series of short, sharp cries, almost like a chant, as the shape vanished between the trees. For a moment the clearing was still, save for the hiss of the torch and the slow sound of Cole's breathing. But the quiet was not peace, it was the pause between strikes. From deep in the forest came a sound unlike the others, a single long howl, so low and deep it seemed to pull the heat from the air, and in that sound was not hunger but command. The cubs stiffened, their eyes snapping toward the trees. Cole felt the ground tremble faintly under his boots, as if something far heavier than the two predators was moving in the dark. The settlers on the wall began shouting again, their voices higher, now filled with real panic, and someone rang the alarm bell, a dull metallic sound that carried over the clearing. The cubs pressed in close to Cole, their bodies warm against his legs, their eyes never leaving the tree-line, and Cole knew, without being told, that whatever had given that command was coming, and that the two predators he had faced were nothing but scouts for something far worse. The mist shifted, and for a breath he thought he saw a shape far larger than the others, its outline broken by the shadows of the trees, but the sense of its size and weight was enough to send a cold ache through his bones. The cubs gave a soft, low growl, in unison, a sound of warning and defiance, and Cole tightened his grip on the torch, though he knew the flame in his hand would be nothing but a spark against what was coming. The howl came again, closer this time, and the predators that had retreated answered from somewhere in the dark, the sound of their voices weaving together into a chorus of threat. The cubs stood their ground, the settlers stayed on the wall, and Cole stared into the shifting mist, knowing the next moments would decide whether any of them saw another dawn. The air was heavy with mist and fear, and Cole stood at the edge of the clearing with the cubs pressed close against him, their eyes wide and bright in the dim light of the torch in his hand. The settlers on the wall above shouted warnings, but their voices sounded distant, muffled by the weight of the night, as if the forest had swallowed every sound except for the low growls that rolled through the dark trees, each one deeper and heavier than the last. From the shadow of the forest the first golden eyes appeared again, followed by another and another, until the clearing seemed ringed with points of molten light, each one fixed on him. And the cubs, the predators, did not rush forward. They weighted their bodies low and tensed their movements slow as they shifted in the mist, circling and watching as if they were testing the edge of his courage. Cole kept the torch high, the heat burning his arm, but he did not lower it. The cubs made low chuffing sounds to each other, some stepping forward a few paces, then back again, as if ready to defend their place in the circle behind him. He could hear the gates creak as the settlers considered opening them to pull him inside, but the moment passed, and the gates stayed shut, the fear of what waited in the dark keeping them frozen. A shadow moved between the golden eyes, larger and heavier than the others, and Cole knew, before it stepped into the light, that this was the leader. The shape was massive, its shoulders broad enough to block the glow of the eyes. Behind it, its head carried low its breath, a slow, steady hiss that cut through the damp air like the sound of distant thunder. The leader stopped a few steps from the line where the mist met the open ground, its golden eyes brighter than the rest, its gaze fixed on Cole with a weight that felt like a hand pressing against his chest. The smaller predators fanned out to the sides, their low growls blending into a constant hum that made the ground seem to vibrate under his boots. Cole stepped back slightly, feeling the cubs move with him in perfect unison, their trust in him so complete that none of them broke formation, even though every instinct in their small bodies must have been screaming at them to flee. The leader tilted its head, as if curious at this sight, its gaze shifting from Cole to the cubs and back again before taking another slow, deliberate step forward. The torchlight caught on the scars across its muzzle, deep and old marks that spoke of battles fought and survived. Its fur was darker than the others, almost black, with only faint hints of the golden brown that shone in the eyes of its pack. It was a creature built for killing and survival, and it carried itself with the calm patience of something that had never lost a hunt. Cole's grip on the torch tightened, and he forced his breathing to slow. The heat pressed against his face, the flame dancing in the slight breeze that moved through the clearing. The leader's eyes flicked to the fire, and then back to him, and Cole knew it was measuring him, deciding whether the flame was enough to keep it at bay, or if tonight would end in blood. Minutes passed with nothing but the slow shifting of shadows and the low hum of growls, until the leader gave a short, sharp sound, a command that sent two of the smaller predators forward, their bodies low, their movements like flowing water in the mist. Cole swung the torch toward them, and they stopped just out of reach, their eyes never blinking, their bodies swaying slightly as if ready to spring. The cubs let out high, sharp cries in response, a sound that seemed to hold the predators in place for a moment longer. The leader took another step forward, its paws silent, its breath steady, and Cole knew it was pushing the limits of the fire's reach, testing how close it could get without feeling the heat. He stepped forward to match it, the torch between them, the cubs shifting again to stay tight against his back. The mist curled around their legs, cold and damp, but the circle held. From the trees more eyes appeared, the pack growing larger with each passing moment, the sound of their movements soft but constant like the rustle of wind through long grass. The settlers above muttered to each other, their fear clear in every word, yet none climbed down the wall, for to leave its safety was to face the same fate as the man standing in the clearing. The leader's gaze never left him, and then with a sudden sharp movement it lunged forward, stopping only when the tip of the flame brushed close enough to send a ripple through the fur along its face. The smell of singed hair cut through the cold air, and the predator snarled, a sound so deep it made the cubs flinch, but they did not run. They stayed close, their eyes fixed on the leader, as if daring it to come closer. Cole's arm shook from the strain, but he held the torch steady, his other hand reaching behind him to touch the nearest cub, not to pull it away, but to reassure it. The cub pressed closer, its body warm against his leg, and he could feel its heartbeat fast and strong through the thin fabric of his trousers. The leader's eyes narrowed, its body lowering again as it began to circle to the side, and Cole moved with it, the two locked in a slow, careful dance around the edge of the clearing. The smaller predators shifted restlessly, their growls growing louder, as if they were waiting for the moment to break the standoff. The leader gave another short sound, and they stopped again, still and tense. The night stretched on, minute by slow minute, the cold seeping into Cole's bones, his muscles aching from the constant strain. Yet he did not let the flame drop, and the cubs did not leave his side. At last the leader stepped back a single pace, its gaze still fixed on him, and then it gave a final low growl that rolled through the clearing. The other predators began to melt back into the mist, their eyes fading one by one, until only the leader remained. It stood there for a long moment, silent and still, and then turned slowly and walked back into the forest, the mist swallowing its massive shape until there was nothing left but the faint sound of its heavy steps fading into the distance. The cubs stayed pressed against him for several breaths longer, their bodies slowly relaxing as the danger passed. Cole lowered the torch just enough to ease the strain in his arm, but he kept it lit, for the shadows beyond the clearing still held movement, and the night was far from over. Somewhere deep in the forest another howl rose, a sound that was neither close nor far, and carried the promise that the hunt would continue before the dawn came again. Cole stood there in the mist, his breath visible in the cold air, the cubs beside him, the torchlight flickering across their small, determined faces, and he knew that this night was only the beginning of something far greater than a battle for survival. It was the start of a bond the predators could not understand, and perhaps would not forgive. The mist still hung over the clearing like a living thing curling low around the legs of Cole and the cubs, while the torch in his hand flickered against the damp air, and the golden eyes of the predators had long vanished into the darkness. Yet the forest felt far from empty, and the silence carried a weight that pressed down on every breath. The cubs stayed close to him for a long time, their bodies warm and tense, as if they feared the shadows might open again and spill out more hunters. But then the smallest cub stepped forward, its head turning toward the deep line of trees at the far edge of the clearing, and it gave a single short sound almost like a call. The other cubs turned their heads toward it, and then toward Cole, their eyes bright and unblinking in the faint light, as if asking him to follow. Cole hesitated, glancing once toward the settlement wall, where a few figures still stood behind the barricade watching, but none called to him, and none made a move to open the gates. He tightened his grip on the torch and stepped after the cub, the others falling in around him as they moved across the damp ground into the shadow of the trees. The forest swallowed them quickly, the air cooler under the thick black canopy, the branches overhead twisted together so tightly that only thin threads of alien starlight found their way through. The cubs moved with practiced silence, weaving between roots and fallen logs, their small forms little more than shifting shadows in the mist. Cole followed their path, keeping the torch low to avoid brushing it against the wet leaves that hung close on either side. The deeper they went, the more the sounds of the settlement faded, until there was nothing but the soft rustle of paws and the occasional drip of water from the leaves. The forest smelled of wet moss and old earth, and somewhere far off a slow rhythmic sound like the pulse of distant water echoed faintly through the air. The cubs moved steadily, never rushing, yet never pausing, as if drawn by something they knew could not wait. After a long stretch of weaving through the dark shapes of trees, the ground began to rise into a slope covered in vines and thorny brush. The smallest cub climbed it with quick light steps, and the others followed. Cole pushed through the tangled growth of thorns, catching on his clothes, until at last he found himself standing before a break in the hillside, a narrow opening half hidden by roots and stone. The cubs slipped inside without hesitation, their eyes glinting briefly in the glow of the torch before vanishing into the dark beyond. Cole ducked and stepped into the opening, the air inside cool and damp, the walls rough with stone and coated in patches of faintly glowing moss. The passage curved downward and widened into a cavern where the ceiling arched high overhead like the inside of some ancient cathedral. The light from the moss bathed the space in a greenish glow, and the shadows danced along the walls with each movement of the torch. In the center of the cavern was a shallow ring of stones, and inside it lay carvings etched deep into the rock, each mark worn by time, yet still clear enough to read as shapes that told a story. Cole knelt and traced one with his fingers. It showed figures like the cubs, but taller, stronger, standing beside a human. The style was crude, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was a memory of an alliance, one that had existed long before any settler had stepped foot on this world. The cubs gathered around him, their eyes fixed on the carvings, some letting out low, soft sounds as if speaking to each other and to him. At once Cole felt the weight of their gaze and of the story in the stone, and wondered if they had brought him here to remind him of something he did not yet know. The torch crackled in his hand, the light shifting across the images of hunts and battles, where human and cub stood together against shapes that seemed far larger and far darker than any predator he had seen. Before he could study the carvings further, a low sound rumbled from the entrance. The cubs turned as one, their ears rising, their bodies stiffening. The sound came again, deeper this time, and Cole knew, without looking, that the predators had found them. The torchlight caught the faint gleam of golden eyes at the far end of the passage, and more pairs appeared beside them until the darkness seemed filled with fire. The cubs did not retreat. Instead, they stepped toward the entrance, their bodies low, their teeth bared in perfect unison, their small growls echoing in the cavern. Cole stood beside them, the torch raised high, but he knew the predators would not be stopped easily in this narrow space. The largest of them stepped forward, its head low enough that its back brushed the ceiling, its body blocking the opening entirely. Behind it, the others waited, their shapes restless in the shifting mist that clung even here. The cubs looked up at him, and he understood their meaning. They had brought him here, not just to show him the carvings, but because this was their ground, their place of strength, and they would not run from it. The glow of the moss cast strange shadows across the stone ring, and the images carved there seemed to move, with the flicker of the torch the human and cub shapes almost alive, as if watching what was about to happen. Cole took a deep breath and stepped forward until he stood at the edge of the stone ring. The cubs, closing ranks around him, the lead predator, gave a sharp growl and lunged into the cavern, its claws scraping on stone, its teeth catching the torchlight. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Cole thrust the torch forward, the flame meeting the rush of its breath. With a flare of heat, the predator snarled, but kept coming, its weight pushing him back toward the ring. The cubs leapt at once, their bodies a blur of fur and claws, their voices a chorus of snarls and cries. They struck at the predator's flanks, forcing it to turn and snap at them. And in that moment Cole stepped in again, driving the torch toward its eyes. The beast recoiled, the light blinding it in the dim glow of the cavern. The other predators outside began to push forward, but the narrow entrance forced them to wait, giving the cubs and Cole a precious few breaths to hold their ground. The fight pressed closer to the ring, the carvings on the stone seeming to burn with reflected firelight. As the predator's roars filled the space, Cole felt the heat of the torch and the rush of movement around him, the cubs fighting with a ferocity that belied their size. The lead predator staggered back for a moment, its golden eyes narrowing before it gave a deep guttural sound to its pack. The eyes beyond the entrance flared brighter in answer. Cole knew they could not hold this place for long, and the cubs seemed to know it too, yet none of them gave ground. The cavern echoed with the clash of claws on stone, the hiss of the torch, the low growls from the shadows beyond the entrance, and the steady pounding of his own heartbeat as the long night deepened and the true weight of what they faced pressed in on all sides. The cavern was filled with the sound of breath and growl, and the flicker of torchlight across the green glow of the moss made the walls seem alive with shadow. The cubs held their ground against the lead predator, their small bodies darting in and out with strikes that forced the larger beast to twist and snap, but never break. Through Cole stood in the center of the stone ring, the carvings under his boots feeling like the weight of history pressing up from the ground into his bones. The narrow entrance was still blocked by the massive shape of the leader, and beyond it the golden eyes of the rest of the pack shifted and swayed with restless hunger. They wanted the cubs, and they wanted him. The air smelled of damp stone and the sharp scent of burned fur from where the torch had met its mark earlier. The predator's gaze fixed on Cole with an intensity that felt almost human, as if trying to decide what manner of creature would stand among prey and refuse to yield. The cubs gave short, sharp calls to one another and began to spread in a loose arc between Cole and the predator, their bodies low, their claws scraping against the stone. The leader let out a long, deep sound that seemed to vibrate through the cavern walls, and then it lunged again, its bulk forcing the cubs back. Step by step Cole moved forward to meet it, the torch raised high, the flame flaring bright in the close air. The predator's head jerked toward the light, and in that instant two of the older cubs leapt together, striking at its side with claws and teeth. It roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, its weight shifting just enough for Cole to thrust the torch toward its face. The heat sent it rearing back, its claws raking the stone floor as it tried to push forward and retreat at the same time. The golden eyes beyond the entrance shifted, and more shapes pressed forward, but the leader blocked them, still locked in its battle with the man, and the cubs. The carvings on the ring seemed to flicker in the firelight, and for a moment Cole thought he could see the figures. They're moving, as if the stone itself remembered fights like this from long ago. The human shape and the cub shapes locked together against a larger shadow. The predator lunged again, and this time Cole stepped aside, letting it come deeper into the cavern. The cubs swarmed from both sides, their small forms fast and sharp, forcing the larger beast to turn again and again, each twist slowing at each movement, giving Cole a chance to strike with the torch, the flame licking at its face and chest until the smell of burned fur thickened in the air. The leader snarled louder, its voice echoing like thunder, the sound answered by the rest of the pack outside, but none of them moved, and perhaps unwilling to cross into the ring of stone where the battle had turned against their leader. The cubs worked with strange precision, their attacks timed with each thrust of the torch, as if they had fought beside him before in some memory neither he nor they could truly name. The leader's movement slowed, its lunges less certain, its growls less steady, until at last it gave a short, sharp sound, not of rage, but of command. The cubs froze for half a breath as the beast began to back toward the entrance, its golden eyes never leaving Cole. The rest of the pack parted just enough for it to step out into the mist beyond, and then the golden lights began to fade one by one until there was only darkness in the tunnel and the sound of heavy steps fading into the distance. The cubs stayed still for a long moment, their ears forward, their bodies tense, but no new growl came from the dark hole. Lowered the torch at last, though the flame still burned steady in the damp air. The cubs began to move around him, brushing against his legs one by one, their eyes meeting his in the glow, as if each was marking this moment into memory. The smallest cub, the one that had led him here, stepped forward and pressed its head against his hand, the gesture light but deliberate, and when it stepped back the others followed, each touching him briefly with a paw or a brush of fur before circling the ring. Once more Cole stood in the center, watching them, the heat of the torch fading slowly from his hand as the green glow of the moss grew more dominant in the quiet. He understood now that whatever bond had been carved into the stone here had been reforged tonight. The cubs no longer looked at him as an intruder or a stranger. They looked at him as one of their own, and the weight of that acceptance settled in him with a strange mix of pride and unease, for bonds like this came with responsibilities and enemies alike. The cubs began to move toward the entrance, their bodies low but their steps calm. They did not glance back into the forest, as if they knew the predators would not return before dawn, and Cole followed them out into the cool mist, the night air smelling of rain and earth. The trees stood silent, their twisted shapes outlined faintly by the pale alien moon that hung above. As they crossed back through the forest, the cubs moved in a loose circle around him, their eyes scanning the shadows, their bodies shifting with every small sound, as if guarding him now as fiercely as he had guarded them. The path seemed shorter than before, and when the edge of the clearing came into view, the settlement wall stood dark and quiet, with only a few figures watching from above. When Cole stepped into the open ground, the cubs moved ahead of him, their pace slowing as they passed the gates. The settlers on the wall stared in silence, for no one had ever seen the cubs approach the settlement without hissing or fleeing. The cubs stopped just beyond the gate and turned back to face him, the smallest, letting out a soft sound that seemed to carry both farewell and promise before they melted into the mist toward the dark line of the trees. Cole stood watching until their shapes were gone, and only the memory of their glowing eyes remained in the fog. The torch burned low in his hand, the embers crumbling softly to ash. He let it fall into the damp grass and turned toward the gate. The settlers stepped aside without a word as he passed inside, their eyes following him, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to disbelief. That night in his shelter, the sound of the forest was different, softer, yet not without the distant call of something large moving through the trees. The predators had not gone far, and he knew their memory would be as sharp as the scars they carried, but so too would the bond between him and the cubs, and whatever came next in this strange land, they would face it together. And far beyond the walls, under the alien moon, the leader of the predators stood in the shadow of the trees, watching the place where the human slept, its golden eyes burning with a light that was not yet done with him.